fire on them if she wasn't there. And it was an accurate assumption to make. As much as Sheen wanted to punish Allie and all the others who had turned on the clan, he still expected to go back into good terms with the Crimson one day. He held no personal grudge against the mercenaries. All he wanted was to make them see that aiding those traitors would only bring them trouble. He knew well how much the Crimson hated trouble. It has been 3 years now. I thought that a few months of retaliation would convince those mercenaries to give the traitors up. I suppose Crystal's friendship with their leader is a lot stronger than I assumed, he stated, reaching into the water absently. So tell me, friend, how did your assignment go? The desert. Andrani was a little bit upset for having to leave while Chris was face down in the sand. The assassin was fast and graceful for a blind person. Andrani had to give her that much. That, not to mention that fighting the shadow took a lot of courage. It was without a doubt the deadliest thing Andrani had ever seen in her life. Reason why Dastian didn't use his enlightenment in battle unless it was absolutely necessary. It was all very impressive. And right in the best part of it, she called away by the sight of the travelers. She could have to ask someone what happened at a later time. Travelers coming from the south, that was far more important than some sparring match. Even this one. As Andrani reached the southern gates, a group of mercenaries was already organized there awaiting the command. Open the gates and position yourselves. Do not move unless I command you to, she stated as the gates opened. The men circled the incoming group, and Andrani walked out and examined the oddest group of travelers she had ever laid eyes on. There, each on their own horse, a man in a mask that appeared to be the leader. A large, dark green person? A slim, white-skinned man who seemed oddly all in all, and a woman too, admittedly, had the most normal appearance in the group. She stood there watching the group for a moment before finally putting her focus on the leader. The man had the posture of a person who had seen it all, or the closest to it all as one could see. His demeanor was calm, respectful even. However, it didn't make it seem less of a threat. Andrani wasn't as much of a person-to-person as Dastian, and he wasn't quick to judge, and she liked to think the best of the people until proven wrong. However, the last time a traveler came to them from those parts, they lost many of their people, not to mention their homes. Excuse my less than welcoming posture, kind sir. However, if it is shelter you seek, as well as the word of our leader, I must ask that first you state your name, she said, giving a wave of her hand, so that the mercenaries would lower their weapons. I wouldn't like to betray my clan's good reputation of being laid back and over-friendly, but the last outsiders to pass these gates abused our hospitality in the worst possible way. Reasons why I must now take caution. As she finished speaking, however, footsteps sounded behind her, and before she knew, Chris had walked past her and stopped before the masked man. For what Andrani could tell, the blind woman was slightly shocked and unsure whether she would smile or frown. Finally, Chris let out a small, half-irritated, half-amused snicker. I'll be damned. I was starting to think you had dropped dead somewhere, sir, she stated. Andrani frowned slightly in confusion. You know these people? She asked. Chris turned to face Andrani and gave her a small smile. Not really. I do, however, know this man. She nodded slightly towards the masked individual. Enough to put my life on the hands of any friend of his. With that, she started to walk back to the encampment. Don't expect a warm welcome from Evan, but I'm sure Allison will be more than glad to see you, she stated over her shoulder. Andrani stood for another moment, but finally she gave a nod and the mercenaries dispersed, at which point she gave them a smile. Well, since Crystal is rather fond of her life, for what I know of her, in the name of the Crimson Shadows, I welcome you. If you would be so kind as to follow me, she offered, walking past the gates and leading them into the camp and under the curious eyes of the rest of the mercenaries. One of them ran, most likely to warn Dastian of the visitors. She only hoped there would be no trouble this time. Assassin's Camp. Even though Sheen was his best friend, Even though Sean was his best friend and the only man who would trust him with his own life, Avius still found it hard to take jokes about Allison from him or anyone else for that matter. Even though he'd been told that Allison and Crystal, along with a couple of other actives, had betrayed the pack, and seen for himself that Evan had done the same, Avius still couldn't take jokes about the woman he had loved for so long. It just wasn't possible, and even though he wanted nothing more than to doubt Sean's words on her, the evidence was clear. She had stopped him from performing a tradition done by the pack through several generations and defined her new alpha, and were now positively helping Evan, a traitor who had not only caused so much damage to the pack, but also caused much pain to Avius personally. He couldn't let this mess pass him by, even though he wished he could. Maybe something could be done about the leader of theirs, Avius thought, and came up with several sinister ways of putting someone loyal to the pack in a leadership position inside the Crimson Shadows. However, for now, he kept them to himself, seeing as he knew that Sean didn't have a grudge against them, only the people they were protecting. When the question that Avius had been waiting for turned up, he sighed heavily and let his hand slide down the quarterstaff slowly. An old man, his wife, and their 15-year-old son, all dead. No witnesses, no questions asked. I got in, assassinated them, and got out. Nothing special. Avius reported, just like he used to. Very short. His eyes darted off towards the encampment as he heard voices from the camp growing louder. However, he figured they were just having a laugh, or as friendly as one could be in the pack, argument. Nothing to worry himself over. His attention shifted back to Sheen as he sat down next to him by the lake. Things are changing in this land, and they're changing fast. It might be a breeze when it comes to all the fighting between the cities, and the outcasts might give us a small moment to breathe. Avius began and let his hand touch the water for a brief moment before pulling back, feeling how it was about to twitch again. But we can't stay put forever. We need a plan, and we need it fast. Why? Because soon shit will get real, and you know where we will be when that happens. In the middle of it. The man rose from his position and put away his weapon as he held his hand as it began to twitch furiously. The pain was hard and merciless, but he endured it. The pain just reminded him how much he wanted Evan Banna dead, and what he would do to slit that sick man's throat. It was a pleasant thought, and a bit tad sick. But it was pleasant nonetheless. Here's my suggestion. We should stop focusing on taking contracts and staying neutral. That's what Downey and Crystal did, and look what happened. Avius explained and insulted himself in his mind for speaking ill of Downey, but it had to be done. Instead, we should ensure that once the war starts again, we will be on the winning side. The desert and the ruins of Brightvale. A smile grew across the leader's scarred and concealed face as he motioned for the rest of his companions to follow his lead as he jumped off his trusted horse named Merlin and led his animal and friends into the very ruins he had been trapped in 4 years ago. It had changed, to say the least, and there were more people here than last time, and they didn't seem as hostile. They did, however, seem very curious about him and his odd company, and maybe that would prove to be an advantage that he could use. After following the woman into the ruins, a couple of mercenaries came up to them and told them that they would feed their horses and put them into stables. Their leader approved, and his friends followed his lead. After that, they kept on following the woman with the golden eyes. His meetings with Crystal didn't turn out as he had hoped for, nor as he had thought it would be, but it was good enough to see that she wasn't angry at him, or at least, not yet. The fact that Evan wouldn't like seeing him again and that Allison sure would be happy made him feel like home again. I wouldn't have it any other way, he thought, as Crystal had walked away. As they moved on, he noticed the people had been starting to follow them to see what the odd group might want with the leader of theirs, and who they were. They whispered and bets were made even between some of them. Barker will enjoy himself here. However, I believe I'll have to keep an eye on Ace for a while, he thought as he eyed his companions, who walked right behind him. Ace was not yet impressed, and remained as void of emotions as usual. Barca was smiling and held his helmet under his right arm as he scanned the ruins. Akita remained cool-headed, but he could see that she wanted to go about exploring this place for a couple of hours. Such things would have to wait, though, as they reached their destination. A ring had gathered around them as the company stepped forward, and soon enough they were joined by a young man with dark brown hair and cocky posture, to say the least. Next to him stood the woman the group had been following, and in the crowd the leader also spotted a woman he had grown fond of a couple years ago. However, before he revealed himself to anyone else but the one person who already knew who he was, the leader turned his entire attention towards the cocky guy who he hoped wasn't the leader, but probably was. "I suppose you're the leader of this fine company of men and women. I have many things to discuss with you, if you are willing to listen," the leader said, and bowed. Akita and Barca were the only ones who bowed with him. Being the elf that he was, Ace bowed to no one but himself and his father. That was elven law, and it was what elves were taught from childhood. If you bow, you're weak. If you bow and open yourself up for a deadly strike even from an ally, when you bow, you might sign your own death sentence. After rising to his former posture, the leader looked over Allison before returning his hidden eyes back to the man who might just be the leader of this group of mercenaries. Assassin's Camp. The air was dense in the forest today, and it was abnormally warm for this time of the year, when, in just a few weeks, there would most likely be snow and small bouts of snow on the ground. The humidity and the heat was just unbearable, as if Evan was still in the desert. This was nothing like the day in the desert. Just being in this area should have been a death sentence for him. He had been in the bushes for over an hours earlier, just outside the leader's cabin, and had spent the past 3 hours walking around the camp as if he was just another worker there, sitting by the fireplace and listening to a conversation being had by a few of his actives next to him. "Yeah, that coward," the youngest one shouted. The third one stood up and stretched his arm, looking back at the first man. "You know, I heard that he's been seen in the streets of Blackpond, drunk out of his mind. I think Sean finally broke his spirit." Evan grimaced with his head down, looking out of the corner of his eye where he saw Desmond, the second in command, limping down the path into the common area. Obviously the poison had worked. It could only be a matter of minutes until he wouldn't be able to walk at all. The poison wouldn't kill, but it would sure make his job a lot easier. What wasn't making his job any easier, however, was the heat. He was starting to sweat, and the makeup he had on was starting to run. The scar he made on his left cheek was no longer there, and soon enough his face would be recognizable by almost anybody. He tried to keep his head low, but in his peripherals he could see a few actives pointing and looking at him with contempt. He knew that they knew, but he needed more time. Just about 30 seconds more was all he needed, but it was impossible now. The few actives that had been pointing at him were now swiftly approaching. By these assassins would reach him, he would only have about 10 seconds to kill, and Desmond would be on his knees, unable to move his legs. The 3 actives besides him started laughing at a joke about the supposed drinking problem Evan had while Eric took the bottle out of his coat. "You know, Eric, I heard somewhere that Evan doesn't drink, but even more interesting, I heard that he's sitting right beside you." Evan raised himself off the log seat and grabbed the bottle out of Eric's hand, smashing it over his head. Spinning on the ball of his foot, he threw a jagged glass right at one of the assassins who was approaching him. This caused him to let go of the sword that he had drawn. "Protect Desmond and alert Sean!" one of the instructors ordered. That was when Desmond finally fell to his knees, unable to move from the position. All of the actives made a barrier around Desmond to protect him, while a couple of others began to sidestep out of Evan's line of sight, just to the left and the right of him. Evan took out a single throwing knife and said, "If you don't mind, tell Sean to go check on his sister. If I use the proper dose, her heart should be stopping in the next 12 to 15 minutes. Let him know that's what he gets for killing Allie's recruit." Evan quickly sidestepped, avoiding an oncoming attack from behind. "Hold on, I'm not finished." He threw the throwing knife straight up into the air. "I bet that I will have killed Desmond before the knife hits the ground." Evan wasn't typically a gambling man after he had lost 200 gold to Majoria, but he was about to make an exception for this time. If he had calculated his throw correctly, he wouldn't have to worry. Again from behind, he heard an assassin running towards him. This time, Evan wasn't going to be so kind. He turned around, drawing his dagger, parrying the assassin's attack. He didn't bother